Hey, so this week we are going to talk about westward expansion of the United States and the War of 1812 and the beginning of Manifest Destiny. So let's get started by just really quickly taking a look at who the first 7 presidents are of the United States. So it's good stuff to know. I don't really like to, focus too much on these guys, but just good to have a basic idea of who these first 7 were, and we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson here a little bit today. So there was a response to white expansion by different Native American groups, and one of the biggest examples of response is by Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh. So these are 2 brothers. They kind of started the spiritual and political revival. So Tenskwatawa encouraged natives to return to their cultural ways and abandon those European ways, including goods and alcohol, not just culture. And his brother Tecumseh campaigned for this Pan-Indian alliance and had some luck doing so. So some groups wouldn't unite because they were like traditional enemies with each other. And southern groups down near the Carolinas and Georgia and Florida were more prosperous and didn't really face like an immediate threat from the Americans. But there was still a pretty large alliance. We have this Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, where the United States destroyed Prophetstown, Indiana, which was like the cultural center of this unification program. And when Americans destroyed that, it did convince Tecumseh and other native nations to unite with the British, even though they had been hesitant to do so because they wanted to sort of do this on their own. But we do have an alliance between this Pan-Indian alliance with Great Britain after that battle. So there also is this war going on in Europe largely between England and France. So both England and France start seizing U.S. ships because the United States is still trading with both of those nations, and they're trying to limit trade for the other amongst each other. So between 1803 and 1807, Great Britain seized over 500 U.S. ships, France seized over 300. And in addition, Great Britain was still pressing U.S. citizens into British service for the Royal Navy, which, as we know, historically has been a problem. So in 1807, Jefferson tried an embargo on both of those countries to cease trade, and didn't really work out too well, so that ended up being repealed in 1809. It was largely ineffective. So 1810, Congress officially reauthorized trade with Great Britain and France, but also gave up this offer that if one of those countries would stop interfering with U.S. shipping, then they would prohibit trade with the other nation. So the person who took the United States up on that was Napoleon. And so when Napoleon said, we'll stop interfering with your shipping, then trade with Great Britain ceased. Meanwhile, Great Britain kept seizing, pressing sailors into service, kept harassing the United States. So in 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain. So those are the official reasons. One unofficial reason you might think of is, the year before, if we go back to this slide, Great Britain allied with the Pan-Indian Alliance. And that was certainly a reason for the United States to declare war on Britain as well. So those are the factors in the War of 1812. So when we have this war, keep in mind Great Britain is allied with different Native American nations that are allied with Tecumseh. And this alliance won several battles in the north, up near Canada and the Great Lakes. Meanwhile, in the south, the United States was winning more victories under the command of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson famously had one battle that was so victorious. About 22 million acres land in Mississippi Territory was ceded to the United States. And in 1813, there's a battle in Canada called Battle of the Thames. And in that battle, Tecumseh was killed. And so when that happened, that really took the wind out of this pan-Indian alliance. And then the following year is when Napoleon is defeated. And when those things all happen, the interest of Great Britain and the Native Americans to continue fighting the United States is really pretty low. So after Napoleon's defeated, British forces do end up capturing the capital at D.C. and end up torching a bunch of buildings, including the president's home. And after that building was torched and the Madisons had to flee the area, they ended up repainting the home to sort of hide this destruction. And then it was painted white and then called the White House. So we have a stalemate. No one's really interested in continuing the fighting. No one's really winning. So we have a peace treaty that's signed on December 24th of 1814. And the fighting still continues for a while because this treaty, the news of the treaty didn't travel super quickly. So 2 weeks later, Andrew Jackson and his troops destroyed the British troops at New Orleans. So it did take a while to reach. But we do have a peace there in 1814. Okay, so another thing I want to talk about is the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise took place in 1820, but before that, in 1818, if you look at this map here, you'll see we have 11 free states and 11 slave states. But both Maine, right here, and Missouri, right here, they were not yet states and they wanted admission. And so this was kind of being talked about. There was worry between the North and the South about who was going to retain power. So the North did have more representatives and a larger population in general because of that. Of course, there were the same amount of senators, 2 per state. But if Maine was admitted as a free state, then it would be unbalanced unless Missouri was admitted as a slave state. And it was quite obvious that Maine would be admitted as a free state because it's up here with all those free states. Missouri looks like it might be kind of leaning towards being a free state because it's near all of these, but it does end up getting admitted in this Missouri Compromise. But before I talk about that exactly, I do want to talk about this transcontinental treaty line, because that is fairly important. That's a treaty that took place between the United States and Spain, basically just to officially acknowledge that this was the boundary between the two nations. Okay, so 1820, we have the Compromise, which stated that Maine would be a free state, Missouri would be a slave state, but it also said that this line here, Missouri Compromise line, slavery would be forever prohibited in the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase that was above that line. So all of this, not including Missouri, of course, that's being admitted as a slave state, but everything in the purple here is closed to slavery forever, and that left the South with this small Arkansas territory that was open to slavery. So that definitely freaked out the South because they only have this small area to push slavery into, whereas this is all being kept slavery free. Okay, and I do want to talk about Andrew Jackson a little bit, who was, determined to be a war hero of the War of 1812. So Andrew Jackson was a wealthy plantation owner, but he superficially argued for the cause of commoners and basically of, all white men. That's basically who he was arguing for. He was opposed to using government power to advance the wealthy. He argued for democratic freedom for all white men, so no property requirements. And he was highly popular in the South, but he was also basically popular anywhere that there were white men. So he was a very, very popular guy. If you look here, I have a quote of Andrew Jackson to kind of demonstrate what he thought of Native Americans. He said, "My original convictions upon this subject have been confirmed by the course of events for several years, and experience is every day adding to their strength. That those tribes cannot exist surrounded by our settlements and in continual contact with our citizens is certain. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and a superior race, and without appreciating the causes of their inferiority or seeking to control them, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear." So basically saying they've done this to themselves, they're stupid, they have no morality, they don't care about how stupid or immoral they are, so we need to just get rid of them. So that is definitely something that is part of his agenda. Jackson was heavily in favor of the concept of manifest destiny, pushing all the way through to the West, getting rid of any non-white populations that were in there. And largely that's because he wanted to get land and economic opportunities for white people. All right, so we will talk about removal then, since we're talking about Andrew Jackson. This expansion that he was a fan of was definitely at odds with different Native groups. And we have the Miami Confederacy that was in the southeast that have about 75,000 people there. In the U.S. in 1800 have about 5.3 million people. By 1850, 23.2 million. So there's a large population boom that takes place during this century. As I stated, Jackson was heavily anti-Native American. He was opposed to natives living in land that white people could settle on. And he was opposed to dealing with natives peaceably. The federal government shouldn't treat them as equals, was what he was thinking. And in 1817, he said, and this is a quote, that he long viewed treaties with the Indians an absurdity. And, you know, most white people at this time agreed with his views. So we have the removal of Cherokees from Georgia. And this is the official Trail of Tears here that you can see in the red to the Cherokees being forced out. So in Georgia, there was a treaty that ensured peaceful cohabitation and, you know, retention for the Cherokees of their land and their autonomy. And the Cherokees had this constitutional democracy. They had high literacy rates. They had an economy based on ranching and agriculture. They were doing really well there. But they also had gold, and that was discovered in 1829 by white people in Georgia. And when that gold was discovered, it was pretty much the beginning of their demise here. Congress, with encouragement from Jackson, passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. And so what this did was it nullified 50 years worth of treaties with different native nations. And it created this new Indian territory, which you see here in the orange, in Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska. And it moved the natives there by force. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court had determined that Indian nations were domestic dependent nations. And this meant that they were under the federal government, but they had more authority than the state government. So state governments could not tell different native nations what to do. However, in 1832, Georgia then declared its authority over the Cherokees. The Supreme Court ruled against Georgia, but then Georgia ignored the ruling and nothing happened. So 1835 is when the United States creates this treaty with a very tiny representation of the Cherokee people, in which all land in the East, all Cherokee land in the East, was given to the United States. In return, they got some land in Indian Territory and some cash. Of course, that all went to the people making the treaty. So in 1838 is when the Cherokees are rounded up, some of them imprisoned, and they're all escorted by soldiers on this 800-mile journey to Indian Territory, where 100,000 people were forced west, and about 20% of them died during removal. We'll continue in a minute.